All right. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to this week's Founders, where I'm going to review, for those of you who are new here, the last 7 founders of the day, 5 of which I wrote or published in the last week on my website, founderoftheday.com. And the other 2 over the weekend are drawn from my gigantic archive of going on 900 articles I've written in the last 2.5 years. So, thank you for joining us, and let's get right into it. I have a whole bunch of fun founders this week. There's a lot of humor going to be coming our way. But right off the bat, let's start with the fact that we're going to be discussing several students of George Wythe this week. And one of these is inspired by our first founder. And let's take a look at him. It is Henry Clay. Now, I need to let you know, Henry Clay doesn't really count as an American founder, so I do apologize, and I'm going to pop you back up here for me. Henry Clay is not really an American founder. It's a very big stretch to call him that, but the beginning of his career did overlap with the American founding, and even though he's better known as part of the great triumvirate with John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster during the age of Jackson and leading up to the American Civil War, he did get his start coinciding with the American Revolution. So I did write an article about his early life, specifically because, as I said before, he was a student of George Wythe. And George Wythe, whose name I've mispronounced forever as Wythe, but thank you, Ned, for correcting me. George Wythe is famous for educating many of the founders in the law, notably Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, and James Monroe, who would be a president. How could I forget? And notably Henry, among a laundry list of other American founders. But Henry's early life is very interesting because he was born just leading into the American Revolution, or after it already started, technically. And although his father died when he was young, Henry was given the opportunity to... his father died when he was young, but his stepfather took very good care of him and gave him the opportunity to work in a essentially as a clerk in a grocery store, for lack of a better term, but he did get the opportunity to work as a clerk for Virginia's court system, during which time he met George Wythe. And Wythe, again, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and at this point, pretty fresh off going to the Constitutional Convention. Although Wythe didn't sign the Constitution, he left early as his spouse was very ill at the time. Either way, he was a major contributor and one of the most important American founders, as we will see throughout this discussion. So, Henry Clay finds Wythe and ends up impressing the now much older man who has developed palsy and has trouble writing, and he brings Henry Clay on to work as his secretary and to take dictation. And I forgot, there was a fancy word I learned for someone who takes dictation, but I forget. Man, I should have wrote it down. I knew I should have. I knew I would remember right now on camera. Anyway, because of this, in exchange, Wythe essentially educates Henry Clay in the law. And again, this is a man who taught Thomas Jefferson, soon-to-be Chief Justice John Marshall. George Wythe had a profound impact on the legal minds that created the United States of America. Hi, Nachos. Thank you for coming. Either way, Clay actually studies under him for several years and passes the bar in Virginia, but his stepfather and his mother and much of his family had moved out to Kentucky, and Clay follows them out to Kentucky, where he establishes himself, and even before the age of 30, technically illegally is elected to the United States Senate after several years of teaching at Transylvania College, which was the first college west of the Appalachian Mountains, and I think I'm going to be writing about that soon. My audio is a little low. Well, thank you very much for letting me know. I will speak louder, and I will turn it up just a bit. Is that a little bit better? I hope that's a little bit better. Thank you for letting me know. Anyway, Henry Clay was, I just turned it up, but you're on a little delay. Let me know how it sounds. Anyway, Clay, like I said, he would teach at Transylvania College. He would join the Kentucky House of Representatives right after Kentucky becomes a state, or a few years after Kentucky becomes a state, and really make his name there, make his mark there, and would come back during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. He would first get to the United States Senate. And like I said, he was actually just under 30 years old. So technically was illegally being a United States Senator, but no one seemed to notice. And arguably, like, Henry Clay might not have actually known that he was not old enough to make it. Hey, TJ, thank you for coming. I'm glad you can make it this week. So anyway, as I said before, Clay would go on to do big things. He would be either in the Senate or the House of Representatives for the next 60 years and be one of the most important statesmen in the history of the United States. But his relation to the American founding really falls under George Wythe. Again, we are going to run into Wythe a lot this week because I found a website called Wythepedia, which essentially is about not just the life of George Wythe, but everyone related to him and his educating and his founding. So definitely check that website out. I should have put a link in the description below. I forgot. I apologize for that, but it's really interesting, and it put me in a little rabbit hole. So we are going to discuss other actual founders who were educated under George Wythe, because like I said, he was educating Thomas Jefferson in the 1760s, and now we're talking about the year 1800. Thomas Jefferson is going on president when he's teaching Henry Clay. It's how important Wythe was. But let's move on to our next founder, which of course was from Friday, is an anti-federalist. I'll bring up my image here, although I will note, not much of an image. I just have a picture of the publishing of the anti-federalist we are going to discuss today. And it is the Federal Farmer. I'll bring myself back. And the Federal Farmer is one of, if not arguably, the most important anti-federalist papers written. And what's most important about it is it's a series of papers that were put together and really are the most fluent argument, if not elegant argument, against the United States Constitution. Interestingly enough, the Federal Farmer published several times in the autumn of 1787, and then when it was published in pamphlets, it was so successful that he decided to do a few more and take advantage of it the following spring. Now, the main pamphlet was titled Observations Leading to a Fair Examination of the New Constitution. Well, let me do the whole thing. Observations leading to a fair examination of the system of government proposed by the late convention, and to several essential and necessary alterations in it. In a number of letters from the Federal Farmer to the Republican. That's how long it is as I'm reading it, and I thought I was done. It's 2 full sentences. They used to really know how to title things back then. Either way, the first thing we want to talk about the Federal Farmer is who wrote it. And the answer I've come across is we don't know. Now, for a very long time, it was assumed that the person who wrote it was Richard Henry Lee, a name you might recognize, a very important person. Yeah, Nacho, throw out your question. I'll get to it after when I get to a breather break halfway sometime in here. Thank you guys all for coming and commenting. So, Federal Farmer was assumed to be Richard Henry Lee for quite a while, but research that was first done by Gordon Wood, who is one of the most important American Revolutionary historians of the second half of the 20th century, and Herbert J. Storing, who is the one who finalized the collection of anti-federalist papers. Where is it? Here. I'm pretend I'm prepared. The Anti-Federalist, and of course you can't read it because it's bright. This is the Anti-Federalist Writings by the Opponents of the Constitution, edited by Herbert J. Storing. As I've said before, Murray Dry was his teacher, and Murray Dry put together the Complete Anti-Federalist, which is 9 volumes, and it's hard to find, and it's super expensive, of every Anti-Federalist writing. Herbert J. Storing finished that collection when Dry died, and then also put out this, which is more affordable. It's only $35. But, and in it, he discusses both his idea and what Gordon Wood, I looked into what Gordon Wood had to say. And it seems that the first person who claimed that Richard Henry Lee wrote the Federal Farmer was someone in Connecticut or somewhere in New England who had no contact with Richard Henry Lee and just assumed it was him. And it was written on the side of a letter. And because of that, it bloomed into people thinking, oh no, it's definitely Richard Henry Lee. But in hindsight, it might not have been, because the arguments do conflict a little bit with other arguments he made. And Richard Henry Lee is the type of person who, when he published anonymously, would tell some friends in some letters privately, hey, I wrote this, and kind of brag about it. Also, he was very specifically angered at different things than the Federal Farmer was specifically angered at. Now, of course, like I said, the Federal Farmer is extremely thorough, and it's, if my mind escapes me exactly how many it was, but it was, 20 or so separate letters. So, I did not go through all of them individually like I did with the Federalist, but instead, I want to narrow it down to some of the more important points. But let it just be said, we do not know who wrote these. it is probably not Richard Henry Lee, as was long assumed. Anyway, there are two main points that the federal farmer is really upset about, and these are the 2 points that the federal farmer believes are the most essential to a free government, and that is representation and trial, the way trials are handled, trial by jury. First of all, with representation, on this greatest scale, the federal farmer did not think that the United States Constitution could accurately represent the people of the United States in the House of Representatives because it was too big. First of all, it could not really access the minute details that bothered individual communities about what was going on in the bigger picture federal government. Additionally, it just could not, every representative could not respond to the size of the population. If I'm not mistaken, when the original Constitution said for every 30,000 citizens, a state will get 1 representative in the House of Representatives. And he thought that was too big back then. And that's actually been changed. We don't follow the Constitution anymore, because if we did, then the United States House of Representatives right now today would have approximately 11,500 people in it. And it's kind of messy with the 435 we got now. And imagine 11,000 people trying to squeeze into Congress to talk about pressing matters. And this was a concern of the federal farmer, who was like, it's bad now, it's going to get worse. Furthermore, he was really upset about trials. Now, I will note that after the Bill of Rights was passed, many of his complaints were rectified by the Bill of Rights. That's one of the reasons the Bill of Rights did pass, is many of the anti-federalists, not only in the writings, but at the conventions, said, hey, like, we need to make these changes. Like, you've left too much out. We need a Bill of Rights in there to help us out. But with trial by jury, the federal farmer was specifically upset that there was a lack of certain rules. The Constitution only said there would be a trial by jury guaranteed for crimes. And he thought this was a little bit vague because certain financial disagreements would not have trial by jury. But just because there's a disagreement in finance, it doesn't mean that anyone necessarily committed a crime. It just might be a little bit of confusion is all. But still, he thought there should be trial by juries in those scenarios. Also, he was afraid during the Revolution, one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence against the King of Great Britain was that people were taking great distances to trial. In many cases, brought across the Atlantic Ocean for trial in England. And at this point, the United States Constitution just said a trial had to occur within the state it was committed. But you're in a big enough state, that can be pretty intense. And as we discussed recently, during the Alien and Sedition Acts, people were brought great lengths just within the state of Vermont. Were brought 50 miles, which when you don't have a car, 50 miles in a car is still an hour of driving. And when you didn't have a car, like, this is a day's journey. More than a day's journey in many cases. Just within Vermont. And no offense, Vermont, but you don't have the most land in the whole wide country. Because of this, again, federal farmer was making a stink. Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, you can just drag someone from, here to there, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, so this complaint was actually addressed in, I think it was, the 6th Amendment, which says that the trial by jury would have to happen. They added an important word, and it was districts. Now, again, districts is a little bit vague. They were talking about federal judicial districts, but those pretty much nowadays, at least, conform to your county, though at the time it didn't. And for the most part, the original judges were in the District of New York, the District of Pennsylvania, so it didn't really do a lot right off the bat, but it did end up being resolved, fortunately for a federal farmer. Although, as I said, the complaints about doing the will of the people in the House of Representatives, and we don't talk about modern politics on this channel, but they don't, certainly haven't gotten a call directly from my representative, that's for sure. Either way, let's get to the question. Nachos, have I ever heard of an election like this one from the past? Again, I don't want to talk about modern politics. American history is for everyone, and if I were to talk about modern politics, I would turn off at least half of the audience. because fortunately, we do have a pretty eclectic group here that come to Founder of the Day from all sorts of the modern political spectrum, which I'm pleasantly pleased about. That being said, there were certainly uh, controversial elections in the past. I mean, heck, you look at the election of Thomas Jefferson to president. He ran very closely against John Adams. The first time they ran it, when John Adams won, he only won by 3 votes in the Electoral College, if I'm not mistaken. And then Thomas Jefferson didn't even win outright. Thomas Jefferson tied with his vice president, Aaron Burr. And Burr didn't just concede right off the bat. He was like, "Oh, you mean I might be president? Okay, let's just sit here and not say anything for a while." Yes, Matt, absolutely. I was just talking about Henry Clay, and Matt brings up the John Quincy Adams election. That election was so close, no one won outright, and it was John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. And they were all pretty close. And at this point, the Federalist Party had died, so there was only one party. It was only the Democratic Republican Party. So all these 4 men were running as president for the same party. And what happened was, as it did with Thomas Jefferson, as it has happened on a few occasions, it went to the House of Representatives, who got to make a decision. And that's when the, quote, corrupt bargain happened, because Henry Clay kind of ceded his will to be president and threw his weight behind John Quincy Adams, who in exchange named Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. And what's interesting is, at that point, Secretary of State was looked to be the next president. Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson, who would be president. Jefferson's Secretary of State was James Madison. James Madison's Secretary of State for a while was James Monroe. James Monroe's Secretary of State was now President John Quincy Adams. So naming Henry Clay as Secretary of State kind of said, "Hey man, after I'm done, you can be Secretary of State." This made Andrew Jackson quite unhappy, and Andrew Jackson had, to my understanding, did win the popular vote, and he was, in all not likelihood, but for all intents and purposes, a populist, talking about the will of the people, even though he was super wealthy, but he did come from a mild background. And then, Jackson calls it a corrupt bargain and makes a big stink in the media, and a few years later, Andrew Jackson becomes president. And so, if anything, Matthew is probably right. That election is very similar to the election as we see it today. But not only are we starting to talk about modern politics, we have now moved into the age of Jackson, and on this channel we very specifically like to talk about the American Revolution, which is why I only talked about the early life of Henry Clay and did not get into all this, but it's good we're talking about it, because Henry Clay, who also was with John Quincy Adams in Europe when they signed the Treaty of Ghent together, ending the War of 1812, which I do consider a part of the American founding. Anyway, thank you for your questions. Feel free to throw some more out here. I am going to move on to the next one, and this is when things get a little fun, because we're going to talk about a gentleman whose name is Humphrey Plowjogger. And now Humphrey Plowjogger you might recognize as this man, who is the father of someone we were just discussing. This is John Adams. John Adams. Why would I call him Humphrey Plowjogger? Well, come back to me. Let's talk about it, because in 1761, a 26-year-old John Adams heard James Otis speak and talk about writs of assistance. And I will explain what writs of assistance are, but he was so infuriated about what was going on in Massachusetts that he decided to do something about it. And as a 26-year-old, and we like to picture John Adams as an old man, but as a young 26-year-old, not boy, but a young lawyer, fresh out of college, starting his own practice. Well, he took up his pen and started writing anonymously, and the name he wrote under was Humphrey Plowjogger, which, as far as pseudonyms go, I absolutely adore. It is probably my favorite one. Can't tell you why, it's just something inside me. But we think of Ben Franklin writing Poor Richard's Almanac. We think of Mercy Otis Warren as an author. We think of Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration, and Thomas Paine writing, The Crisis and Common Sense, and we think of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison writing the Federalist Papers, and we think of John Dickinson writing Pennsylvania Farmer. We don't think of John Adams as an author, but John Adams did make his name, at least his pseudonym, as a writer. And he would continue to write throughout a good portion of his life. And he's forgotten about this, and that's why I republished this one last weekend. It's one of my favorite articles I've written because it is so overlooked. John Adams, here's James Otis, another overlooked founder, but that's a different story. He's talking about writs of assistance, and writs of assistance were pieces of paper written technically by the king, although permission was given to the royal governor to write them out. And if you gave a writ of assistance to a person, then that person was now basically a police officer who can search and seize any property from anyone as long as they suspected it was illegal. Now, this meant that there were certain people with writs of assistance kind of kicking in doors and saying, I'm going to come look at your stuff. This looks illegal. I'll take this nice, this fine china. Where did you get this? Again, in Boston particularly, but all through the colonies, smuggling was a problem. John Hancock was a smuggler. And so the idea that like literally anything in a house could be illegal wasn't that crazy because many things were being smuggled in. What's very interesting about the taxes in the United States, in colonial America, these taxes were always there. We think of the Stamp Act and these other taxes that the Patriots were so upset about. When they made the new rules following the French and Indian War, Parliament actually lowered the tax. They didn't just create the tax and say, yeah, you got to pay this tax. No, they already had a tax, and they cut the tax in half and said, okay, enough with the smuggling. We're going to make you pay the taxes, but we're cutting it in half so you can afford it. And the John Hancocks of the world said, no. We're going to keep smuggling. And that's why these writs of assistance were created. Now, you can see how people would be upset about a blank check, essentially, for people to come in and not kick in your door, although they could get the militia if they wanted to, but bring a writ of assistance and say, I'm looking through your stuff, let me see all your stuff, going through your stuff, and essentially taking what they want, and oftentimes just keeping it. This made James Otis mad, who was friendly with Sam Adams, who was also mad, and his cousin John Adams was very unhappy about this. And although this is long before John Adams was even close to independence, it was still very important that he started writing this, because he wrote this for under Henry Plowjogger against writs of assistance in 1761. So the French and Indian War wasn't even technically over yet. It's 3 years before the Stamp Act and 13 years before the first Continental Congress. But it is where John Adams really started making a little bit of his name, because he would follow this up by writing a few years later, before the Stamp Act Congress met, he wrote what was called the Braintree Instructions. At this point, John Adams wasn't living in Boston. He was living in Braintree, Massachusetts. And he wrote what was called the Braintree Instructions as the representative of his town, writing to the actual representative of his town in the colonial government, saying, this is what we need you to do. So he wrote the Braintree Instructions that were published in local papers, and over 40 other towns, essentially almost word for word, copied what John Adams wrote and sent it as instructions to their representative in the colonial government. So John Adams' original Braintree Instructions were a major force behind the colonial government really standing up against the royal governor and therefore king and parliament. And this is... John Adams is as I said, I forget if I had him 3 or 4 in my list last week, but he is the top 4, if not top 3, most important founders. If his presidency went a little better and Jefferson's went a little worse, I would probably put John Adams as number 3 most influential founder, because this is 1760s. This is 35 years before he'd be president of the United States. And that's that. So I have obviously gotten a little bit worked up. I'm going to take a sip of my water. If you guys have any questions, Plowjogger catches your attention. I agree, TJ. All right. Forgot to trim my beard. Got a little water in it. I apologize. We are going to move on to a gentleman that looks like this and goes by the name of Theodoric Bland. Yes, Theodoric. Love it. So, I'm going to bring you back and we're going to talk about Theo Bland for a little bit. First of all, Theodoric Bland was the nephew of Richard Bland, who was kind of like James Otis, an elder statesman of the Revolution. He dies before the war is won because he's much older, but he was his uncle Richard was writing letters and being involved in important cases in Virginia years before, before John Adams was even writing his plow jogger. Either way, Theodoric grew up pretty wealthy. He actually was sent to Europe to get his education and studied medicine to be a doctor, but when he returned, ironically enough, he had poor health and he decided not to follow medicine because of his poor health. Instead, just ran his family's plantation, which, again, obviously, many aspects of plantation ownership is not great, but sorry, I got distracted by Matt. No, Matt, Franklin is number 2. Franklin's the first American. George Washington, first citizen, and father of his country, and father of something else at the end of this conversation. So stick around to the end because George Washington is the father of something hilarious, and we're going to get to it. But no, Franklin is easily number 2. The only one who can even compare to George Washington, in my personal opinion. But thanks for trying. Anyway, Theodoric Bland comes back. He starts running his family's plantation. He's an excellent horseman. And when the American Revolution breaks out, he joins the Continental Army and he becomes a favorite of George Washington's because he's so well known as a horseman. So Bland is put in charge of the Continental Army's 1st Continental Light Dragoons. Now, my understanding, as long as I'm getting this correct, dragoons aren't technically a cavalry. A cavalry rides their horses in and fights on horseback. Dragoons ride their horses in, dismount, and then fight on foot, and then get back on. At least that's how the German dragoons worked. I believe the Continental Army dragoons were the same. Why else would they use the same terminology? Although I have not looked that up, so I'm not 1,000% positive, but I'm like 900, 9999998% positive. Anyway, these become extremely important. Washington uses them mostly as scouts throughout the middle the New Jersey and New York campaigns in the Mid-Atlantic. At one point, I have a quote here from Washington because Theodoric Bland writes to him and says, "Okay, we have some prisoners they're slowing us down a little bit. We're gonna bring them." Washington writes back and says, "No, just stash the prisoners somewhere safe. Maybe stash them with the local militia, but I want you to come because he, quote, would not have a horseman left behind." Because these cavalry was so important, not as spies, but additionally not just as spies, but as men who can act similar to the flying camp, where they can get from one place to another on horseback very quickly. Excuse me. So, the main heart of Theodoric Bland's service, the most interesting story, is he gets in charge of moving the Convention Army. So, the Convention Army wasn't really an army, so to speak. It was a captured army. After the Battle of Saratoga, John Burgoyne and his entire army of British soldiers and Hessian troops who were fighting at Saratoga were captured. As you probably know, the Americans won at Saratoga and they captured this army. So they took all these prisoners and first they walked them to Boston. And that's when these prisoners got the name the Convention Army. I don't know why convention, but it was the captured army. And they were in Boston under the watchful eye of Horatio Gates for a while, but it was very hard to keep them under control in a city because it was hard to determine, okay, who was like a person and who was a prisoner. So eventually the decision is made to move this Convention Army of thousands of prisoners from Boston to Virginia, outside Charlottesville, Virginia, around where Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is, blah, blah, blah. And who do they put in charge of moving this army? Theodoric Bland. Theodoric Bland somehow is able to march in a prisoner army 700 miles to Charlottesville, Virginia. And yes, there were people who escaped along the way. You're moving a couple thousand prisoners 700 miles. Some people are going to escape, but for the most part, they got there, and it was considered an astounding success. Many of the other founders were extraordinarily impressed with what this young man could do. He was still a very young man, only about 30 years old, if I'm not mistaken, when they did this. And after that, Theodoric Bland actually watched the Convention Army and kept them there for months and months until eventually, as I said, he always did suffer from ill health, and eventually that gets to him and he does leave. Although, like I said, he had been serving the war for several years and undertook this astonishing trip across most of then the young United States. After this, he retires, but of course, his country needs him. So Theodoric Bland is then sent to the Continental Congress, and he spends 3 years, the maximum amount of 3 years in the Continental Congress. After that, he attends the Virginia Ratification Convention for the United States Constitution, though interestingly, he votes against the United States Constitution. And despite this, or perhaps because of it, his community then elects him as an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives, where Bland goes and is the first group of people sitting in the United States Congress. Unfortunately, his ill health gets to him at the young age of 49, and he has the dubious distinction, and he's probably best known for this, of being the first member of the House of Representatives to die in office. William Grayson had already died in the Senate, so he's not the first person to die in Congress in general, but he is the first person in the House to pass away while serving his country. So that is Theodoric Bland. Theo, I love his name, as you might well have noticed. And next we're going to talk about a gentleman named Rolway Colston. I'll bring this up, but it's not a picture of him. It's a picture of Haiti, or what at the time was called Saint Domingue, I believe it was pronounced. But I'm going to bring me back up because I don't have a picture of him. And the reason is there is no picture of him, at least that I was able to locate, that I am knowledgeable about. As I said earlier, I went on a little bit of a Students of George Wythe hole this week on Wikipedia. Like I said, check it out. It's hard to put down. As I fix my hair. Nope. Good enough. Okay, now I'm back to it. Anyway, Rolway Colston was a young student of George Wythe who graduated and became a lawyer, and he decided to go over. He actually was not a great student at first. His parents also died when he was orphaned at fairly young, stayed with a friend of his father's as he grew up. He ended up working in a law firm, as he admitted, did very little work. And then he quit and lived a leisurely life for a year or so, and then eventually he realized, okay, I'm just being lazy. I'm wasting my life, essentially. And he decided to go study, and this is a surprisingly old age for the time, but he was already 20 years old when he started studying law. Started under George Wythe, definitely the way to go. Became a lawyer, started practicing law, and immediately grew tired of the industry because he thought being a lawyer was kind of gross. I'm paraphrasing his words, but that's essentially what he said. And I do want to note that if you go to Wikipedia under this guy, and it's elsewhere too, I confirm that it's real. He actually wrote in his family Bible, not just a history of his family, but like an autobiography, like in the front pages of his family Bible. And it's really interesting. It's very brief, but it's pretty funny. And he's very self-reflective. Like I said, he doesn't like being a lawyer, so he kind of quits. And he calls himself, he's like, I'm being too leisurely for a while. It's really funny. He also had an interesting story where before his parents, when his mother died, his father bought him and his brother, because they were still very young, bought him a trumpet and a drum, and bought his brother a little fake horse and a little carriage. And they put the carriage on a cat. And the cat ran away and tried to squeeze through a little window, and in doing so, shattered the carriage to shreds. So it was no more. It was short-lived, but he and his brother got a good, hearty laugh out of it during a very sad time in their life. And I'm glad I remembered to share that story with you, because that story did not make it into the article. It's pretty funny, though. Either way, this goes on, and Rolway Colston, Raleigh Colston, I think it's pronounced Raleigh, but it's spelled R-A-W, like Raleigh, so I don't know. Either way, Raleigh Colston grows up, ends up becoming a lawyer, doesn't like it. The Revolutionary War breaks out, so he joins the Virginia militia. Now, he tries to join as an officer, but he literally shows up late. And he does not get an officer position, so he doesn't join. Instead, he finds a different way to help his country. And he's commissioned as Virginia's agent, and in essence, also the Continental Army's agent, or Continental Congress's agent in Saint Domingue, which today we know as Haiti. And he goes there and he follows a similar path to William Bingham, who we talked about a few weeks ago. What William Bingham was doing in Martinique, he did in Haiti, which was essentially communicate with Benjamin Franklin and Celestine in France, have French goods sent before France sides with the Americans. France sends goods and arms and all sorts of things to him in Haiti, and then he therefore sends it to the United States to help the United States fight the revolution. He does this for a better part of a decade. Even after independence was declared, it was still a good place, the West Indies, to sneak around the British and get goods from Europe to the American patriots. And he made, as he calls it, an easy fortune doing this, being a gun runner, being a weapon smuggler. Again, I told you he was very funny. Eventually, after a decade, he does come back to the United States. He marries a woman, her name escapes me, but she is a niece of John Marshall, who would go on, as we discussed, another student of George Wythe, who would be a very influential Supreme Court Chief Justice. He marries his brother Thomas's daughter. And in doing so, most of the rest of his life, he moves on to a plantation and practices law and invests in land. And he carries on a kind of a lengthy correspondence with George Washington. And most of this revolves around his family and specifically his wife's family and the Marshall family's dealings with George Washington in various capacities, from land to animals, blah, blah, blah. That kind of thing. So that is the story of Rolway Colston, and I hope you enjoyed it. Now, this next gentleman is very interesting. I had known very little about, I've heard this name over and over again, and never really looked into him too much until this past weekend. And his name is James Innes. I believe it's Innes. There's two N's, so it would be Innes. James Innes, who was known to be one of the biggest men in Virginia. He did so much, and it's hard to believe I had not heard. I mean, like I said, I had heard of him, I had read about him a little bit, but it's hard to believe I didn't know more about this person, because he was extraordinarily important to Virginia's fighting in the Revolutionary War. I called him in this president of Virginia's Board of War, but he was a young man. He went to college, William and Mary. Again, he's on Wikipedia, though we're not certain if he studied under George Wythe, at least studying law. He most certainly was studying there while George Wythe was teaching at the college, William and Mary. So he counts as another student. This week's number 3, although we did discuss John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson, so we've talked about 5 of Wythe students this week alone. The last founder this week will not be. You stick around. It's hilarious. But either way, James Innes was attending William and Mary. The war breaks out, and he does something similar to what Alexander Hamilton did in New York, where, just like Hamilton did with the Hearts of Oak at King's College, James Innes organizes a bunch of students into a militia, and they practice on the lawn of the college. That's where they drill to get ready. And they contact the state of Virginia, who says, you know what, we need someone to defend an artillery magazine. And Innes leads his company of students to defend the magazine. Unfortunately, they choose another gentleman whose name eludes me. It was Doohickey something, and I am going to be writing about Doohickey. His name was Doohickey Arundel? Looks like Arundel. Okay, but either way, the gentleman... I will be writing about Doohickey soon. I need to do a lot more research. There's something very interesting. It's going to be a fun story, hopefully for next week. Either way, James Innes is passed over for leading this company that he assembled. And then he gracefully resigns. Arundel, do you know the name, Matt? Do you know this person? Because he sounds really interesting. Either way, James Innes goes on to... He leaves the company he put in the militia, but he goes and joins the Continental Army instead. And he does get a position as an officer there. He serves in the New Jersey campaign under George Washington, many of the battles in that state. He rises to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and then he returns to Virginia. And this is when things get really interesting, because when he gets back to Virginia, and again, he's only about 23, 24 years old at this point, and he's put in charge of Virginia's Navy. Oh, I've not seen that quite yet, Matthew. I apologize. I did see a notification, but I've been avoiding Facebook today, as you might understand. Either way, he gets put in charge as a young man in charge of Virginia's Navy. And each state, as I've said, each militia was technically a different army, and each state technically had their own navy, although some barely existed. Virginia had a very small navy, but this young man is put in charge of it. Interestingly enough, he's soon put in charge of Virginia's Board of War. He acts as both president and clerk, so he's running Virginia's Board of War, which is overseeing all the Virginian soldiers in the war. Now, this only lasts about 6 months because there's a bunch of rearranging done. When Virginia moves the capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, they kind of reorganize everything and the position's eliminated. But it's really interesting to know that this man in his mid-20s is running the show as far as Virginia's military is concerned. Of course, subservient to the governor, who's commander-in-chief of the state forces. Now, he ends up going back and practicing law and James Innes gets very good at practicing law and becomes one of the most respected orators in Virginia. In fact, he goes to Virginia's ratification convention and he's for it, and he is actually the last person to speak at the Virginia ratification convention. And he speaks so forcefully that even Patrick Henry, who is himself the most famous orator from Virginia and a major anti-federalist, even he acknowledges that James Innes brought the power of all of America to Virginia with this one powerful speech. And again, Virginia only went by 10 votes. It was, I believe the number was 189 to 179 was Virginia's vote for the Constitution. So that's 6 people who need to change their mind if Virginia doesn't ratify. And there were people who were questioning it right up till the end, and James Innes' powerful speech is one of several people who were able to convince enough delegates to vote for the United States Constitution. What's extremely interesting now is after this, first of all, I discussed the other day, and not everyone watches this video, but I do recommend you go back and watch the video about Ware versus Hilton, the Supreme Court case. It's very interesting because it's the only time that Patrick Henry and John Marshall would argue before the United States Supreme Court, and they argued that day with James Innes was on their team. And it's one of the things that led me to reading more about Innes in the last week, on top of the whole Wikipedia I found. But George Washington and then John Adams both approached Innes for several different positions in the federal government, and he turned them down every time. Now, I've seen different indications of what they offered him, but it seems like George Washington offered Innes a cabinet position, and Innes said no thank you, and instead wanted to be Attorney General of Virginia. This is very interesting because, as I like to say frequently, people were very attached to their state. Before the Constitution, the states were separate countries in their own mind. And even after the Constitution, many people really thought it was more important to be working for their state. Famously, John Jay left the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States to become governor of New York. He thought that was more important, at least for him at that point in his life. And Innes, who had so forcefully and powerfully argued for the United States Constitution, wanted nothing to do with the federal government and just wanted to work as Attorney General in his state. Now, the reason he always turned down these positions being offered to him at the federal level was that he suffered from ill health, and that's what he at least always said. Now, this, of course, was before it moved to Washington, D.C., which probably would have been easier for him to make the trip. But interestingly, this was fortuitous because he passed away in 1796, just after John Adams became president, and he was just 44 years old, which is pretty young. And I did reflect a little bit this week that a lot of these men cited ill health and then kind of just died. And I don't want to acknowledge that they didn't necessarily die young. We have this tendency to think nowadays that people just died younger than we did back then. That's not necessarily true. People did die all the time from things that we survive today, childbirth and certain diseases and such. But, many people lived, if they survived to adulthood, most people would live a fairly long time. However, if someone suffers ill health for a while and then dies, again, James Innes at 44, we just talked about Theo Bland, who died at 49, and they both suffered from ill health for a while. They might have had a disease that we didn't know about. They didn't do the best autopsies best then, so he could have had some form of cancer or something of that nature that they wouldn't have known to diagnose at that point because it wasn't demonstrable in you couldn't see it if it was on the inside. But it could obviously affect you, and they could have died from that. So that's just a footnote. Now, we're going to get to our last founder. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. And now, I like to keep this channel as clean as I can. I try not to say cuss words, talking about modern politics, that kind of thing. But right now, we have to talk about the one founder who was the biggest ass. As it specifically was put, the biggest jackass. And when I say this, I mean quite literally an ass. As George Washington put it, his ass. Now, I'm clearly joking. If you look at this picture, it's a little blurry, but this is a picture of, well, a 17th century donkey, aka what the founders called an ass. And I was oh so pleasantly pleased to read George Washington use the word ass. And I will stop saying it now because, as I said, it is a family channel. As I said before, George Washington was a lot of things to his country. He's the father of his country, and he's the first citizen. But what I didn't realize until last week when I first came across this, George Washington is considered the father of the American mule. Yes, he is the father of the American mule. And I'm not good at graphic design, but before we move on, I'm going to scroll up here and show you this fantastic picture I made of George Washington and his donkey. Please, by all means, make fun of me. And I'm back. So, George Washington had a farm. And on this farm, he had a donkey. But to backtrack a bit, for the most part, George Washington and all the other plantation and all the other people in America, their transportation was horses. Horses were the animal everyone used. Washington, until 1785, had nothing but horses. But he understood that mules could be beneficial to the United States as pack animals. That they could carry almost as much luggage as a horse at about the same speed, a little less luggage and a little slower, for a lot less food and a lot less water. So it made them very, how would you say, not convenient, but good, attractive. It made it very attractive to people who own farms and plantations to have this kind of animal. And even during the American Revolution was the first time Washington tried to get his hands on a good donkey. There were some donkeys and mules in the United States, but they were not very well bred. They were a little bit weaker than what they wanted. And the best donkeys, for whatever reason, came from Spain. The northwest of Spain, right on the border of Portugal, for whatever reason, bred the best donkeys available. During the American Revolution, on several occasions, Washington tried to get his hands on some of these donkeys. Unfortunately, he could not, until 1784, he finally makes an arrangement with a merchant in Spain to get him one of these special donkeys. Now, the donkeys were so important to Spain, and they were so proud of them, that the merchant had to get permission from King Charles III, to send them across the ocean to the United States. Now, King Charles, when he found out they were for George Washington, said yes, absolutely. Because I'll remind you, Spain and America had a tenuous relationship during the American Revolutionary War, and Spain did also fight Britain. It's hard to say that they took America's side, but they did also fight Britain and were important. And as I've mentioned, Bernardo de Galvez, the royal governor of Louisiana, is one of, I think, 8 or 9 people who were ever given honorary American citizenship for their service to this country, despite not actually being a citizen of the country. That being said, a few weeks ago we discussed the minister Gardoqui, who came over from Spain as the first representative of Spain to the United States, and had a long negotiation with John Jay throughout the 1780s. And Gardoqui had just showed up about the time Washington got permission to get a donkey. And this was looked as a very symbolic gesture by the king, trying to show goodwill despite the fact that he would not let the Americans use the Mississippi, and that still led to many tensions, and it didn't end up working out. But what did work out is George Washington got his ass, because the king selected 2 donkeys to send to Washington. They were sent from separate ports in Spain on separate ships to separate ports in Massachusetts to make sure one survived the trip. And this is fortuitous because one did not survive the trip. And I don't know if that one has a name because it didn't make it here, nor does it make it into the story. But one did make it to the United States. Its name was Royal Gift. And it's no surprise Washington gave it the name Royal Gift because it was a gift from the Royal King of Spain. Royal Gift arrives in Massachusetts. Washington sends one of his boys up to get the boys, I meant like friends, or I should say one of his representatives up. He did not send one of his slaves, and I want to make sure when I'm using the word boy, I'm not using it in a racist way. He sent one of his white representatives up there, one of his boys, to get the donkey, and they traveled from Massachusetts. It took 25 days from November to December, probably pretty cold, but he traveled with the donkey, who, again, one of the reasons they got the donkeys is they could travel for a very long time without much food or water. 25 days down to Virginia. Here it is. Washington gets Royal Gift. And that is really the last founder today, is not George Washington, but Royal Gift. Because Royal Gift is the actual father of the American mule. George Washington is the father of the American mule, but Royal Gift is quite literally the father of American mule, because for those of you who are uninitiated, and I did have to look this up because I didn't know, the way you get a mule is you get a boy donkey and you get a girl, a lady horse, and you make children with the boy donkey and the lady horse. And those children are mules. You're welcome. Doing a little bit of science today. A little bit of animal husbandry at Founder of the Day. We like to do a little bit of everything here. So the fact that he got this donkey, this boy donkey, that just needed some female horses and you could just make all the mules you wanted, that's where American mules come from. All of them. Because Washington not only used his mares, I think is a female horse name, not only did he use his mares, but all his neighbors in Virginia brought their best female horses. And actually, Royal Gift was brought to South Carolina for a while to help make some of their mules, and then brought back to Virginia. And, Royal Gift ended up living, I would assume, a life of luxury, being fed all the finest donkey foods and having all the highest quality female companions brought to him. I'm trying not to be gross, but that is what happened, and I can only imagine that he was the happiest of all American founders. And that ass is the father of American mules, and there has become a breed of American mule, and the actual name escapes me, but they're one of the biggest breeds of mules in the world, because again, these plantation owners, and I know we look at the plantations as places that own slaves, and there's a lot of unhappiness that occurred on plantations, but they were also places of, this is the end of the Enlightenment, and these people were experimenting with things. Jefferson famously crossbreeding plants, and Washington was a smart man and an entrepreneur who wanted to learn how to breed. That's why he got a donkey from Spain. It's because he knew he could take these superior horses they were already breeding in the United States and make the world's most superior mules. And essentially that's what they did. They made, it's still around, the American mule. There's another scientific name for it that escapes me, but the American mule. And George Washington, he hasn't done enough, is also not just the father of his country, but the father of the American mule, all thanks to his very nice ass. I had to do it one more time. I apologize. This is the only chance my outside private life humor gets to find its way in Founder of the Day. But yes, that's George Washington, not as well known as being the father of the American mule. But interestingly, if you go to Mount Vernon's website too, they have a whole bunch of infographics about it, and it shows how in 1785 Washington had 120 something horses, and that's it. And then by 1796, when he died, 11 years later, he only had like 50 horses and a bunch of donkeys and then a bunch of mules. Like 50%, 60% mules. Because he really did believe they were a better animal. I know we don't see him as much, but we also don't see as many horses as we used to either. Also, and this is off topic, but I'm going to leave you with this. If you guys go look up camels in the United States Army, that was a little bit later, just leading up to the Civil War. Unfortunately, it was promoted by Jefferson Davis, so after the South ceded, anything he was associated with was looked down on, but camels have an interesting history also. Misfits, what's up? Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. And that's pretty much it. So I'm sorry if you just showed up, Misfits. I've been at it for about an hour. We just talked about George Washington and his ass. Go back and you'll see what I'm saying. It's not a joke. I am going to leave you. I'm running a little bit. I'm running out of a little bit of steam right now, but I do thank you all for attending. And I am going to leave you with a nice round bottom. I feel like that feels right, especially right today. Thank you for coming. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Founder. Oh, and if you're coming for trivia on Friday, which you should be, first of all, make sure you watch all this. I should have said that at the beginning. Make sure you watch all this because there are some, not all the questions, but some of the questions at trivia on Friday are going to be related to today's discussion. And furthermore, Liberty & Co. has officially sent me the box of goodies and sponsorships. I was a little bit late, but everyone who has already won a prize, your prizes are on their way. And everyone else, make sure you show up because I'm not sure what we're giving away first, but he's giving me a whole bunch of fun stuff. So thank you to Tyson for that at Liberty & Co. Thank you guys for watching. Thank Washington and his ass, and round bottom.